So today I want to talk about sensor size. I feel it's one of the main things you need to consider when getting into wildlife photography, but I want to present it in a really simple way because I feel like a lot of the videos out there are quite technical and quite complicated, and frankly that's not really what this channel is about. I want to try and make photography as simple to understand as possible. If that does sound of interest to you, consider hitting the subscribe button for more videos just like this. But for now, let's start by talking about the different types of sensor. For the purposes of this video, when I'm referencing a large sensor size, I mean a camera that has a full frame sensor. When I'm talking about a crop sensor, I mean an aps-c size sensor, although I'll briefly talk about the micro four thirds system as well. Let's start by talking about one of the main ways that sensor size is going to affect your image. That's by talking about the effective field of view. For this, I've set up a very simple demonstration. No expense has been spared on this video because what I have here is a 50mm lens and a cuddly toy rhino. And sit. Good. Now on this camera here, what I have is a full frame sensor, so a larger sensor, and the 50mm view will look something like this. Now this camera here, even though it is a full frame sensor, has the ability to go into crop mode, so essentially showing you what the field of view would look like on a crop sensor camera. Now we haven't changed anything about the lens, but you'll see what has happened here is now it looks a lot more zoomed in. In fact, what I would have to do usually in this situation is I'd probably have to step back, because you'll see that the image now is cutting off the top of the rhino's head and a little bit of its foot. You can see how much it has been zoomed in if we compare the two images side by side. The crop that this camera has done is an aps-c crop, which is effectively a 1.5 times crop. If you compare this to a micro four thirds camera, that would be a 2 times crop. The takeaway message here is that a smaller sensor size is going to lead to a longer effective focal length and a smaller field of view. The next thing to talk about is the low light capability. A smaller sensor is going to be collecting less light at any one time. On a bright day like this, it's hard to believe this is a bright day, it's British summertime. I'm wearing a jumper. The sensor size is less likely to be a factor that you're going to have to worry about, whereas at night time, or such as within this wood, by having a larger sensor, it means I'm going to collect more light, meaning I can push my ISO slightly higher and I can have a higher shutter speed without getting too much noise. That means I'm more likely to be able to freeze any action I do get from shots within these darker places. The other question people have when thinking about crop sensors is, does a crop sensor have a less blurry background than a full frame sensor? The short answer of this is no. However, it is more nuanced than this. There are 3 things that affect how blurry a background is. The first one is the focal length of the lens. Generally, a longer focal length lens is going to have more compression, so the background is going to look more blurry. When we think back to our example at the start with a rhino, it took off the top and the bottom of the image. This means to get the same framing as we would have done with a full frame sensor, we'd have to use a shorter focal length. That means we're going to have less compression in the lens and the background is going to look less blurry. The second thing to consider when thinking about how blurry a background is the distance to the subject. This would have been our other option. We could have taken a step backwards. In doing so, the depth of field is going to be larger because the distance to our subject is also going to be larger. So we're going to get a less blurry background. The final thing that affects how blurry the background would be aperture. Now the aperture does not change between a crop sensor and a full frame sensor. This is because the aperture is a physical property of the lens and not the sensor. So changing the sensor size is not going to change the lens at all. This is why when we didn't change the focal length and we didn't change the distance, but we just simply cropped in, the background looked exactly the same. There are 2 more factors to consider that aren't about image quality when thinking about sensor size. The first of which is weight. Generally, cameras with larger sensors are going to have lenses which are much larger than cameras with smaller sensors. That means you're going to have much more weight to carry over large hikes, which might be something to consider if you want to travel lighter or perhaps if you're going on a plane. The second factor, and probably the most appealing factor of crop sensor cameras, is generally they're much cheaper. This means that if you're just getting in photography, they can be a great place to start. The best thing about having a crop sensor camera is that if you want to start to progress to having full frame lenses, is that you can put the full frame lenses on your crop sensor camera, slowly upgrading your kit until you have a full frame lens and a full frame camera. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and leave a comment down below about what subject you think I should talk about next, and I will catch you at the next one.